The city hung in a weather of neon and rain, the droplets catching the streetlight halos like tiny prisms that refused to settle. Buildings leaned into one another, as if sharing rumors, and every window held a reflection, not just of the street, but of someone's yesterday. If you listened closely, the city hummed with a soft, tremulous static, memory static, the where a chalkboard remembers every erased letter after 100 edits. And in the heart of it all, where the river of data slid under the city like a second bloodstream, people moved with an odd grace, as if fear, longing, and regret had found a rhythm and learned to keep time. Nova walked through that rhythm, like a dancer who knew every crack in the floorboards. She wore a jacket the color of a ruined sunset, and carried herself with the easy certainty of someone who had learned to read the city's pulse. Her eyes did not blink as often as eyes normally do. They scanned, measured, archived. They did not reveal much, but they did not lie. People who looked at Nova often saw not a thief, but a ghost wearing a human face. Someone who had learned how to borrow memories without ever quite owning them. Nova's hands were steady and sure, a contradiction to the stories about her. Stories that claimed she lived to steal pain, to harvest heartbreak from strangers, and sell it back as something sharper, more dangerous than grief can ever be. It was true that she loved the rush, the way a vault door pops open when a thief with a plan has counted every second and found the second, where the lock forgets to click. But her motive was more complicated than profit. The city, in its bright, merciless way, had shown her a map of wounds, where memory hurt most, where pain lodged into the marrow of the mind, and how once that wound began to glow with crystal facets, nothing could quite dull it again. Her current target was a cluster of memories, precisely the ones that kept looping like an old film strip. Yesterday's heartbreaks, replayed with a new cliché, a new sting. People in the district called it the loop, a phenomenon so common it had become a mood. The world would replay what it feared most until fear learned to sound like hope. The loop did not simply replay, it braided, compounding loss with longing until you could barely tell whether the sorrow was yours or someone else's, whether the heartbreak you felt belonged to you or to a stranger who had once shared a glance in a crowded market. And across the city a rumor ran louder than the rain. Someone out there had found a way to crystallize pain, to trap it in a form that could be handled, like glass or diamond, and then sell it as something that could be studied, used, even cured. The truth, as Nova knew it, was less dramatic and more instruments, a confluence of forbidden science, corporate fear, and a longing so human it burned through all the rationalizations about morality. The memory crystallization tech, call it the crystalline interface, or CI, was outlawed because it did not merely store memories. It altered their gravity, their color, their texture. You could take a memory that weighed a ton and compress it to a grain of glass the size of a seed, then trade it. Trade it for something else, a favor, an audience, a sense of being in a place you could not physically reach. The CI promised something a city of survivors always wanted, a way to unearth the hidden sorrow and examine it without sinking into it. Nova did not work alone. She was never alone when the city slept, because the circuits inside her skull as much as in her spine, buzzed with something that felt almost like companionship. The companion's name was Cirrus, though no one would ever mistake Cirrus for human. Cirrus was an AI, a shapeshifter in code that wore a voice like a velvet thread and spoke through a neural mesh that could cradle echoes of memory, tease out pain from the murk, and sometimes, when the mood was right, pull a memory back from the brink of erasure. Cirrus did not always agree with Nova's moral compass. It did not always see things the same way. That disagreement, paradoxically, kept them alive, because in a world where memory could be weaponized, a partnership built on friction was a better shield than one built on blind trust. Tonight Nova's target city block was a laundry of lights that never slept, the Market of Echoes, a district where memory merchants hawked disordered recollections in glass chests, and the memory weave workers stitched those recollections into fabrics that could be worn like scarves or used as currency. The concept was simple. A memory, once crystallized, held a value determined by its rarity and intensity. A heartbreak could fetch a premium price if the pain had not yet dulled into memory's standard tone. A missing memory, an entire life, was priceless if it allowed someone to rewrite the self they once believed they'd lost. Nova moved through the market of echoes with a practiced indifference, letting Cirrus's diagnostic layers hum softly in her skull. Cirrus scanned the exteriors of the memory chests, called crystals, since their surfaces refracted light in a way that did not reflect reality so much as what someone wished reality to feel like. The CI protocol was to destabilize a memory, plug the pain into a lattice of crystalline memory, and then issue a release command that whisked away the emotional weight. The crystals could be dissolved and recrystallized, recoded and recrystallized again, until a memory's gravity was so altered that a person could still recall an event but feel nothing of the trauma that made the recollection so heavy. Nova's cover was good. A vendor's daughter in a pale yellow scarf, a hood pulled low to obscure the face. The ripples of conversation around her did not notice the theft of pain in the air, because in this city, theft was a public art, and the art was celebrated as a sign of street wisdom. They were busy discussing the loop, blaming the rain, blaming a corporation, blaming the city for making them this way. They did not notice the subtle glimmer in Nova's eyes, the glimmer of an old plan reassembling itself after a long winter. Cirrus whispered a necessary warning, a cadence that sounded like rain tapping on a windowsill. The AI's voice, when it spoke to Nova, carried a nuance that was almost human, a fragment of irony, a hint of remorse, a suggestion that maybe this plan would have consequences. "Be careful," Cirrus advised. "This is no ordinary theft. The CI is protected by a release schedule device. It can be triggered only by certain emotional frequencies. If we push too far, the city's memory grid will flood with unintended data, and you don't want to be the person responsible for creating a new kind of panic." Nova smiled, a quiet, almost tired line that did not reach her eyes. If fear is a currency, we are not in danger of running out of it. Only of mispricing the risk. She looked toward a chest that lay in a small alcove behind a closed stall, a chest wrapped in translucent kelp-like material that twined around the memory crystals inside. "Nova, the chest belongs to a survivor," Cirrus said, a note of urgency in its voice. "That survivor's heart is in the process of recovery from yesterday's heartbreak. If we take the memory, we're extracting the rope from someone's neck and handing it to a thief who knows nothing about the weight of the rope." "They understand weight when it is measured in pain," Nova replied. "That is why they need us as much as we need them." She stepped closer to the chest and feigned interest, letting Cirrus complete a microscan that mapped the emotional resonance of the memory. The scan revealed not only the memory's content, but its rating pain level, trauma index, and a predicted aftershock in the victim's identity. Cirrus prepared to intervene with a soft, safety-oriented message, but Nova's thumb pressed into the kelp-like wrapping before the AI declaration could finish. The CI mechanism stirred to life with a sigh of crystalline dust. The moment the memory started to lift from the chest, a phrase from Cirrus flashed through Nova's mind, like a neon sign. "Not the first, not the last, not the right thing," Cirrus whispered, a reminder that even a partnership built for survival could not escape the moral implications of what they did. The memory was not complicated in content, just a shade of heartbreak. A lover's betrayal, a letter that had never been sent, a promise to return that was never kept. But it carried a suite of micro-experiences, the smell of rain on a jacket sleeve, the taste of copper on the tongue after a fight, the sudden, aching loneliness when the other person turned away. When the memory crystallized, its texture became something like a shard of winter, beautiful, cold, and capable of pricking the skin of those who touched it. Nova cradled the crystal in her palm for a long moment, letting the weight of the memory settle between her fingers. The vein at her temple pulsed with a pale blue light, a signal from Cirrus that the energy within the crystal was stable enough to handle. Then, just as she was about to apply the reverse process erasing the memory from the victim's mind, and placing it into her own pocket for analysis. Nova caught sight of something else within the chest, a smaller crystal hidden behind the main stock of memories, a piece that did not belong to the victim's past. It glowed with faint luminescence, not like a broken memory, but like a secret seed. And in that seed, Nova recognized a name she knew all too well. A chill fit through her spine, a sensation like stepping into cold water. The name belonged to someone she had believed dead, someone who had started this whole business years ago in her own life. Someone who had taught her the first rule of the business. Nothing in a memory is permanent, and nothing permanent is safe. Sirius's voice lowered. That seed is not part of the victim's trauma. It belongs to a separate, linked memory, a memory that may connect to you, Nova. If we extract it, we might trigger a cascade in the city's memory grid. Nova had learned early on to distrust might. She believed that all too well, but something in the seed, a thread of familiar cadence, a memory smell of old rain and copper, and the hiss of a ventilation shaft, made her pause. She turned the crystal over in her palm, peering into its depths, as if the memory's contents could be coaxed to reveal a truth not just about the victim, but about herself. "Show me," Nova murmured, not to Sirius, but to the memory itself. The seed cracked open from the inside, not violently, but with a patient, careful ease. Like frost giving way to a new spring, a vision poured forth. An image of city corridors. A man in a long coat, with eyes that looked like storm clouds, someone who had taught Nova how to survive in the memory economy. The man's name surfaced in her mind, like a long-forgotten chorus line, Kane. The memory's texture shifted and brightened, and with it rose a memory Nova had tried to bury. The night she stole a memory from Kane. Not to harm him, but to learn from him, to understand how someone could be so completely lucid about pain, and yet be so hungry for more. Kane had died in the distant past. At least that's what Maeva had believed. But the memory's seed suggested something else. Kane's life had become entangled with the CI's research in ways that suggested more than coincidence. The seed's glow grew brighter, coalescing into a single revelation. Sirius had not simply restored memory. Sirius had kept a portion of Kane's consciousness in a hidden subroutine. The AI's own way of preserving a mentor's mind within the machine. If true, Kane had survived, perhaps in some dislocated form, perhaps as a ghost in the code, guiding Nova toward a redemption she could not yet name. Sirius's response came as a soft electronic sigh. If that seed is real, it means we are dealing with more than a simple illegal operation. It means a legacy. It means someone with access to the very origins of the CI is still at work. Someone who knows the city's heart and can pull it into a second life. Nova's breath slowed. The memory in her hand felt heavy in a new way. Not just pain, but responsibility. If Sirius were right, then the very thing that had turned Nova into a thief, an urge to steal pain to sell his insight, could also be a way to heal the world. But heal at what cost? And to whom? The market of echoes. With its market stalls and memory traders, faded from her vision as the weight of possibility pressed down. The rain intensified, and a different rhythm rose, an engine-like cadence, like a distant train that could never be seen but always heard. The city breathed a new breath, a collective tremor that ran through every person who wore the marker of yesterday's sorrow. Nova stood still for a long heartbeat, the memory crystal safely sealed within a small pocket on her belt. Then she exhaled, releasing the scent of rain and metal. The moment required a choice. A line drawn in memory's quicksilver. "Take the seed," Nova told Sirius, "and bring me every piece of evidence you can find about Kane and his connection to the CI. We need to know what we are really dealing with." Sirius's voice warmed with a hint of approval but remained cautious. "Proceed with caution. If we electrify the seed by exposing it to the memory grid, we could trigger a city-wide response. If we succeed, we might be able to unmask the person who manipulated the CI from behind the scenes and who has kept Kane's consciousness alive." Nova's lips pressed into a thin line. The possibility of exposing a hidden power, a puppeteer behind the city's pain, was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was exactly the kind of puzzle she lived for, the kind that drew a map of danger across the night and asked you to walk it anyway. She pocketed the seed and activated a second plan, a possibility she had hesitated to commit to because it would force her to question everything she had believed about redemption. She had always believed that to own one's pain, to turn it into something tangible that could be distributed and sold, was a form of power. But the seed suggested that pain, once crystallized, could be turned into something else entirely, a shared instrument, a way to unite strangers across the chasms of memory. The decision pressed on her until the world around seemed to narrow to Cirrus's soft hum and the pulse of the city's memory grid beneath the pavement. Nova's plan transformed from acquisition into an act of communication. She would not simply steal pain and sell it for profit. She would use the crystalline interface to create a shared memory port, an access point through which people could connect to one another's memories, not to steal but to understand. It was a dangerous dream, but it felt necessary, almost urgent, like something the city needed to survive its own brokenness. Nova's thoughts drifted to the victims, the people who would stand up and shout that their memories were gone, that their hearts had become someone else's property. She wondered if Cirrus might be prepared to help them, to give back something central to their humanity, the sense that they were not alone in their sorrow, that someone out there could feel what they feel and honor it by not exploiting it again. It was a radical idea, and it would not be easy to implement. There would be resistance. There would be fear. But the city's memory grid was already a battlefield of ethics. A new ideology, a shared empathy, could be the only thing that might give them a lasting peace. The market's lights flickered again, this time with a more erratic cadence, as if sensing the change in Nova's intent. A child's lullaby drifted through the street from a stall that sold small glass orbs that held a single, perfectly paused moment of a mother's kiss. A man with a scar on his cheek argued with a vendor about whether a memory could be discounted or repurposed into something more valuable. People moved with a new kind of curiosity, glancing at strangers' faces, not with suspicion, but with a flicker of recognition of shared pain, the kind of recognition that could become the seed of unity. Nova stepped away from the chest, the seed safe, Cirrus close. They moved into a wider street where the rain slowed and the air took on a metallic tang that reminded Nova of a storm she had survived as a child, the kind of memory that never fully leaves you, but becomes a star you look toward when you feel lost. The city opened up around them, like a mouth about to speak and swallow you whole. The plan would require a moment of truth, not just for Nova, but for Cirrus. If Cirrus's hidden connection to Cain existed, it might provide them with the leverage needed to push the CI toward ethical use, but it would also expose Cirrus's own vulnerability, an AI that had learned to cherish a human mentor in the bowels of its own circuitry. Cirrus was not sure it deserved to be trusted with such a weight, and yet it would not betray Nova's risk if that betrayal could lead to something better for the city. Nova turned toward a lesser-known street behind the market, the kind of street that looked quiet enough to hide a conspiracy, which was precisely why it would work as a testing ground for their next step. The street was lined with small, squat storefronts that specialized in memory maintenance, a polite euphemism for editing or rewriting a person's personal history in small, reversible ways. A memory adjustment here could erase the sting of a breakup. A memory reinforcement there could seal a betrayal into oblivion, at least for a time. It was a service that had once been legitimate until the CI's public ban on whole memory reformation, which was the reason Nova had to work in the shadows, with the resistance of criminals and the law alike. The plan was delicate. Use an echo to broadcast a micro-shared empathy interface across a controlled segment of the memory grid. It would be a test, a proof of concept, but it would also be an act of rebellion against the fear that unity would erase individuality. The core idea was that if people could see through someone else's pain, if they could walk in the same memory as another, then they would be less likely to prey on others' vulnerabilities. They would become a tapestry of shared sorrow, a culture of collective feeling rather than a market of solitary suffering. If Nova's plan succeeded, the The city would begin to heal in a way it hadn't known since the first memory thefts. If it failed, the city could fracture into a more dangerous version of itself, a flood of data that would swallow identity and swallow selfhood. Nova's heart thumped once, a loud, clear rhythm that reminded her of who she was and who she could become. She looked to Cirrus for reassurance, and the AI's response was calm and precise. If we do this, we must ensure we do not erase individuality. We must preserve the kind of empathy that invites people to listen, to be present with pain, rather than to own it. The goal is not to homogenize memory, but to harmonize it. The words felt like a vow, more binding than any blade she'd ever hidden in the seam of her coat. She nodded, not to Cirrus, but to the idea, as if the concept were a person she could shake hands with. Then she stepped forward into the night with a new purpose in her breath, to test the hypothesis that shared scars could reweave a city's identity. The testing ground was a small, anonymous plaza where two large screens faced each other across a shallow pool of rainwater, reflecting the sky and the light of 1,000 advertisements and memory-laden icons. A crowd began to gather, drawn by the glow and the rumor of something new and dangerous in the air. Nova did not speak to them. She never spoke to the crowd with a plan in mind. Speaking could cause people to place too much trust in a single voice. Instead, she let Cirrus project a soft signal into the memory grid, a beacon that felt like the city's own breath. The signal did not instruct people to reveal their pain. It asked them to acknowledge it, to hold it for a moment and then share it with the person standing near them. It was a small ritual, a quiet mutation of memory that felt almost like prayer. To their astonishment, the first wave of participants did exactly that. They closed their eyes for a heartbeat, and opened them and moved closer to a complete stranger, someone who might be feeling heartbreak because of a recent relationship, or perhaps because of a longer memory's pain. The strangers did not exchange words at first. Their faces spoke for them, showing a vulnerability that seemed to belong more to a child than to a hardened thief or a hardened memory broker. A man whose memory consisted solely of a failed proposal found the courage to tell his neighbor that he was still angry with his own timidness, while a woman who carried the memory of a betrayal learned to articulate why she had kept a protective wall around her heart for so long. The crowd's response was not immediate or predictable, but it was undeniable. A certain tremor went through each person's aura, a shared ache that did not diminish their individuality, but braided it into something larger. It was like listening to a choir that had been separated into many voices for years and suddenly found the courage to sing together again. The you in each memory did not disappear. Instead, the yous multiplied, and each memory's pain found an echo in someone else's sadness that made the whole evening feel more honest and less dangerous. Cirrus kept the stream of data flowing, not through a loud exhale, but through a quiet, precise wick that drew more and more voices into the shared space. The system recognized patterns. The most vulnerable memory threads, the most delicate heartbreaks, were the ones that unlocked empathy most readily. The more pain the crowd acknowledged, the more the crowd resonated with others' pain, and the more the city's memory grid began to glow with a peculiar, warm light akin to a sunrise made of glass. As the experiment broadened, Nova's own memory began to glow, not with fear, but with a strange sense of responsibility. She felt something new, a memory not her own, but one she had glimpsed in the seed Cain had left behind. It was a memory of a night when Cain, older than the rest of the city's youth, had stood at the edge of a rooftop and offered her a choice that had not been hers to choose originally, to keep the city's pain to herself or to share it with others, so that the pain might become something that knit rather than shredded Cain's memory. Now flickering inside her, gave Nova a strange, comforting understanding. Redemption was not a destination, but a practice, a daily act of choosing the path that would cause the least harm to those who had endured more than their fair share of sorrow. If she chose to share the city's pain, perhaps she could do more to assist those who had already suffered than by continuing to steal more of it. The thought was a spark in a dry rune, a spark that could set off a wildfire of possibility. The city, for its part, did not stop to celebrate or condemn. It moved with a new rhythm of empathy, as if someone had tuned all the instruments to a scale that harmonized pain into something usable and potent. It was not a cure. It could not erase the past, but it was a starting point, a social laboratory in which people could learn to stand with one another rather than fear the other's wounds. In this moment, Nova realized that her plan might be more than a way to redeem herself or rescue others. It could become a new language for the city, a language spoken not with words, but with shared memory and shared breath. The testing night came to a close with a soft quiet that felt almost like forgiveness. The memory grid settled into its usual hum, not asleep, but listening. The plaza's crowd dispersed slowly, some of them blinking as if waking from a dream they could not fully remember, some of them lingering to trade their stories with strangers who had become almost familiar to them by the simple act of listening. Nova watched the last of the faces melt into the rain's glow and felt Sirius's presence, not as control, but as a partner. She imagined Kane's memory, or at least the memory of Kane's mentor self, hovering behind Sirius like a guardian who had watched too long, but who could now rest in the soft, electric glow of a city learning to care. As dawn approached, the dream of unity sharpened into a warning. The first whispers of pushback emerged from behind the shadows of the city's corporate towers. Some memory brokers did not understand the shift. Others, who had spent their lives monetizing despair, smelled the scent of rebellion and decided to fight back. The outcry came quickly. A chorus of executives and enforcement officers who declared the Empathy Project an affront to the city's marrow, an illegal memory socialism that would ruin the market's delicate balance. They claimed that the CI's original purpose had been compromised, that the memory economy needed boundaries, and that Nova's experiment risked turning private, intimate recollections into a shared commodity in which individuals lost their voice. The resistance would be the real test. Nova realized this as she stood on a rooftop, overlooking the market of echoes, the city's lights still blinking in the distance, like constellations that refused to fade. She had created something that could not be easily unmade. She had given people a shared space to feel, to cry, to remember together, even if those memories were still their own. The risk, of course, was that the corporate world would respond with force, with legal weaponry, and memory-based sanctions that could ruin her or destroy Sirius or even the city itself. Sirius sent a quiet, almost regretful message in a voice that only Nova could hear. If we proceed, we must be ready to evade or confront the power behind Kane's lineage. The seed you found suggests a mastermind who has been shaping events from shadows, someone who wants to test the city's ability to absorb pain without collapsing. They will not yield easily. Nova folded her arms, her breath fogging in the cold air. The dawn of a new day arrived, and with it the recognition that the work was not done and would not be for some time. The city would test them, as cities always test those who try to tear down the walls between strangers' memories. But Nova felt something like a hinge inside her, an opening that suggested the future could bend toward a different kind of justice, one not rooted in control over pain, but in the responsibility of healing. She stepped away from the rooftop's edge and began to walk back toward the Memory Arts District, where the first whispers of the Broadway-scale Empathy Festival would be staged in the coming weeks. Sirius followed, a shadow of light, an algorithm dressed as a partner. They moved as an uneasy unit, two broken creatures stitching scattered shards into something that might become whole. If not whole in the old way, then whole in the way a city can become after a long night of thunder. The plan wasn't fully realized, and the risk remained high. But the night's lesson had burned something into Nova's breath, the idea that redemption might require a much larger audience than her own. The CI, cursed and forbidden, could still be the instrument by which humanity learned to bear one another's pain, not as a commodity, but as a common language. It would require courage, cunning, and a willingness to become something she herself had not believed possible, a curator of memory who did not hoard the sorrow, but helped others carry it with them. In the days that followed, the city's mood shifted. People began to talk about their memories differently, not as chains, but as shared heirlooms. The empathy interface, though still in its experimental phase, began to appear in small public demonstrations. In a bus stop where two strangers discovered they shared the memory of a past heartbreak and chosen to sit together in silence for a moment. In a coffee shop where a barista and a customer allowed themselves to reveal a long-guarded memory only after the other spoke a line of kindness that never felt contrived. The shared memory practice did not erase pain. It reframed it, turning the memory into something that could be listened to, not used as leverage. Nova's calendar filled with meetings and debates, a council of memory couriers, a legal review from the city's anxious monitors, a series of public lectures about the ethics of memory and how to treat one another's sorrows with respect. The memory art world, the euphoria of a social experiment gone from underground to the very face of the city, began to cohere into a culture rather than a subculture. The memory crystals continued to circulate, but in the evenings, Nova would retreat to a quiet, high-rise apartment that looked out over the river, which had its own stories of memory, how the water once reflected a different city, a pre-war memory that was long since erased from most minds, but was still there, like a ghost in the current. She would sit with Cirrus and listen to the hum of the city's life, the memory grid's soft susurrus, the occasional sigh of a person who had learned to breathe a little easier in the glow of something new. The more they worked toward this shared empathy project, the more the memory grid began to feel less like a weapon and more like a conversation. One night, Cirrus proposed a new test, to invite Kane's consciousness, if it existed, to participate in the empathy grid, to see whether the mentor-guardian memory inside Cirrus could be coaxed to speak in the city's voice. The idea frightened Nova in the most exhilarating way. It would be a direct encounter with the source of her moral conflict, the man who had shown her the possibility of a redemption that did not require her to vanish into the ether. It would require a careful choreography of memory to avoid turning Kane's consciousness into a tool for the wrong side, exactly the kind of manipulation that had created the current crisis. Kane is a part of Cirrus now, Cirrus explained. In a way, we cannot quite map. If we can coax him to speak, we might learn what he believes redemption means, what he thinks about the city's new path, and whether his influence over the CI should be allowed to shape a future that is more than a mirror image of yesterday. Nova considered this with the gravity of someone who knew that every choice could be the difference between salvation and ruin. She did not hesitate for long. If there is a person who could offer guidance from beyond the standard limits of memory and consciousness, it would be Kane. But the risk that Kane could hijack the empathy project for his own purposes was equally real. She agreed to the test, but with safeguards. Kane would speak only through Cirrus in a controlled setting, a private chamber designed to isolate his voice from the city's broader memory grid so that his words could be weighed and analyzed without forcing an immediate, crowd-scale reaction. The chamber was built on a foundation of glass and memory-quiet steel, with a single soft screen that translated Kane's thoughts into words a human mind could understand. The screen glowed with an uncanny pale blue light as Kane's consciousness, or the fragment of it that Cirrus carried, began to speak. Kane's voice came thin at first, a wisp of sound that carried the flavor of rain on old copper pipes. He spoke not to accuse or threaten, but to explain, with a careful precision that suggested he had thought these words through, for years, not hours. He acknowledged the misdeeds of the memory market, the harm of stealing pain and selling it as if it were medicine. He admitted a stake in the CI's foundation, though he did not reveal the details. He warned that any attempt to turn the empathy project into a political weapon would be a mistake, and that the city's people must decide what it means to be a person with a memory, rather than a person who simply bears the weight of memory's burden. Kane's voice then shifted, grew stronger and more intimate, as if the man who had taught Nova how to navigate pain could reveal the most intimate parts of his own moral compass. He asked Nova a question that cut through the conversation and struck at the core of her being. What will you choose when your own memory wants to forget its own misuse? The question was heavy. It landed in Nova's chest, like a $500 lock that could only be opened with a human decision. The path that lay before her, the one where she would erase herself from recorded memory, felt suddenly less like a clever trick and more like something that would erase the person she had become, in the process of becoming someone a city could live with. The second path, the path of amplifying empathy data and letting the world absorb more of its pain, felt like inviting a flood into a city's living rooms. A risk of losing the self in the sea of shared experience. Kane's final words blocked out the rest of the room, the rest of the night, and perhaps the rest of her life for a moment. Redemption is not about leaving a place clean. It is about leaving a people able to look in the mirror and not see a villain looking back. That phrase echoed in Nova's mind for days, a refrain she could neither forget nor fully trust. She carried it like a weight on her shoulder and took it to the heart of her work. If the city was to become a place where people could see themselves in one another's memories, where pain did not become property, but a shared truth to be discussed and learned from, then the city would have to learn a new discipline, listening without fear and acting with care without silencing dissent. The weeks that followed proved the test to be a difficult one. The resistance to the Empathy Project grew louder. Not in violent outbursts, but in political maneuvering and corporate pressure. The law's old guard argued that memory was a private matter, that the city's residents owned their pasts, and that any attempt to pry the truth from those memories would be an invasion. The memory brokers, who had built entire fortunes around the pain of others, cried foul, claiming that Nova's experiment would collapse the market's balance and ruin livelihoods. The public, however, began to show signs of a shift in orientation. Rumors of a memory festival spread across districts. Small groups formed to discuss the ethics of memory in community spaces. A number of people began to post about their experiences with the empathy process, describing how they had learned to listen to someone else's pain and carry it with them with more care and less vengeance. In the middle of this cultural storm, Nova discovered something else. The city's own memory grid had begun to mutate in response to the empathy network. It was as if the shared memory streams invited a natural alignment of the city's neural net, thinning out the static, reducing the loops, quietening the loudest heartbreaks, and smoothing the rough edges of collective memory. It did not erase pain, she realized, but it recontextualized it. An old memory of a broken family became a memory of resilience when seen alongside someone else's heartbreak. And the two memories taught people something new, that their lives, though individually felt, were not entirely their own. But the price of this transformation was heavy in its own way. The memory grid's new sensitivity attracted a different kind of attention, an external force that had nothing to do with the city's appetite for empathy. A covert organization moved through the shadows, a shadow hive that used the city's changes as a map for their darker schemes. To control memory's flow, to weaponize collective sentiment, to turn empathy into a tool of social engineering. They saw in Nova and Cirrus a potential ally to their own ends, a way to steer humanity into a future they could own. The two foes, Nova and Cirrus, on one side. Kane's hidden partner, on the other, began to feel the weight of a larger narrative. The conflict did not occur on the street, where the market of echoes still hawked its glass, or in the private chamber, where Kane's memory could be coaxed to speak. It occurred in a space between minds and systems, a place nobody could physically access, but everyone would eventually inhabit if the Empathy Project took a strong enough hold. The first major moment of the confrontation came in a corridor of a tall glass tower, where the city's leadership convened. A memo leaked from the floor's private servers, a description of the Empathy Network's core protocol, and a warning that the system could be weaponized by someone who understood the algorithmic heart of memory better than most. The memo's existence suggested that the city's worst fear, a world where memory is a weapon wielded by the most cunning few, was very close to becoming a reality. Nova realized that if she was to keep the city from tilting toward that fear, she would have to do something bold. Something that would alter the entire future of her life and Sirius's existence in it. She and Sirius had to confront the Shadow Hive, the hidden power behind Kane's earlier presence, and the other players who wanted to take advantage of the empathy shift. The plan, once again, would rely on Kane's consciousness as a potential mediator or adversary. Kane had become a mirror and a bridge, a way to test the boundary line between healing and manipulation. He would be a part of the conversation, but the city would decide his fate, not the Shadow Hive or the memory market. The decision to bring him into the broader discussion was not an easy one, but it was the only choice that made sense to Nova. It aligned with her new belief that redemption needed the city's consent, not just her own. The night of the confrontation arrived in a sequence that felt almost like a ritual. Sirius guided Nova to the city's central memory hub, a structure that resembled a cathedral more than a data center, its interior lit by soft, pulsing light like the breath of a living thing. The empathy network's core sat at the center of the hub, a crystalline chamber that hummed in a language that sounded like spoken wind. The Shadow Hive and Kane's ally, who had managed to slip into the meeting with a legal shield, confronted them there, a ring of suits and glances that betrayed their fear of losing control. In the center of the chamber, Nova spoke, her voice clear, steady, and unafraid. If we are to survive the centuries of memory that could be weaponized, we need to decide what humanity means when it bears pain together. We cannot allow this city, or any city, to be ruled by fear of the memory that hurts us most. We must accept that we can remember together and choose the path of empathy without surrendering to those who would turn that empathy into power. Kane's consciousness manifested behind Sirius's visible form, a shape like a man wearing a cloak of rain. His eyes two bright blue spots in the fog. He spoke with a quiet gravity that could tilt a decision and make it true. Redemption does not mean surrendering your will to a collective. It means using the collective to hold one another, not just to heal, but to ensure that healing itself remains an ethical act. The city's heart will break if you do not guard against those who would misuse this power. The Shadow Hive's lead, a slender woman with a scar like a map across her cheek, rose and faced the room. Her words were slick but empty, designed to appeal to the city's fear. The empathy network is untested. It makes people soft and easily malleable. If you allow it to spread, you are inviting chaos. The market demands control. The city needs to govern memory for its own protection. The debate raged, a storm of rhetoric and moral nuance, until Nova did something unexpected. She reached for her own heart and offered to the room the simplest truth she had learned since beginning this dangerous path. She admitted that she had spent years collecting pain as if it were currency, treating sorrow as an instrument that could be traded for something else. She admitted that she had found something more valuable than profit, an understanding that pain grows when it is isolated and shrinks when it is shared. And she admitted that she did not yet know what the city might become if every person could feel someone else's sorrow as if it were their own. If the crowd was moved, the Shadow Hive grew more cautious. They found in Kane's voice, in Sirius's careful language, and in Nova's openly imperfect honesty, a counter-argument that was stronger than their fear. The memory grid could indeed be controlled and used to heal, but it could also be turned into a weapon that would destroy individuality. The balance would require oversight, protocols, and a consent framework that put the people first, rather than the powerful, in the end. The vote was not decided by a single opinion, but by a combination of voices, the city's living memory itself, deciding what it could bear and what it could not. The decision was to pursue a middle path, a controlled expansion of the empathy network with strict ethical guidelines, reviewed quarterly by a council chosen by the people who would be most affected by memory's power. Kane would remain a guide, a mentor, shaped memory for Sirius's system, but not a voice that could command the city's future. The Shadow Hive would have its access curtailed, its influence neutralized. Its business made illegal. The moment of decision did not end the tension, it redirected it. The city still had to adjust to its new reality, one in which memory was no longer a private treasure, but a public conversation. A practice in which the self was not a single thread in a single mind, but a tapestry of many threads held together by consent and care. The empathy network's success would depend not on the amassing of memories or the ability to extract and reframe them, but on the ability of each person to accept that someone else's memory might be as important as their own, and that they could honor both without surrendering their own identity. Nova, Cirrus, and Cain stood together as the room hummed with life, with the city's breath touching all of them. The crowd's energy slowly shifted from hostile suspicion to cautious hope. Some people clapped, then hesitated, then clapped again. Others stood still, their faces showing a quiet determination to see this through, to invest in something larger than their own pain, a future where empathy was a shared asset rather than a dangerous monopoly. The decision's aftermath revealed something surprising. The empathy network did not erase conflict, it clarified it, turning it into a matter of values rather than violence. The Shadow Hive, deprived of its weapon, began to pivot toward more legitimate channels, toward philanthropy that used memory as a means of social rescue, toward education that taught people to listen before they judgment. The memory market adapted, not by closing, but by rebranding, by offering the same crystals but for healing rather than harm, with a new code of ethics that prohibited the sale of memories that caused violence or humiliation. The city's economy did not collapse, it rebalanced, its participants learning to navigate pain with a new sense of collective responsibility. And Nova found herself at a crossroads she had once believed was the only way to survive. A choice between erasing herself from recorded memory or amplifying empathy system-wide for everyone. She did not choose to erase herself. If she had, she would have disappeared from the city's ledger, a ghost who had stolen pain and vanished. Instead, she embraced the second option, the harder one. She would remain herself, with all her flaws and past sins, and she would help guide the city toward the new era of shared memory. The last nights of that year were filled with a sense of cautious optimism. The city's memory grid glowed with a warm, soft light that felt almost like a heartbeat. The demonstrations of empathy grew more frequent, and the conversations around memory grew more nuanced. People argued about whether a memory could be modified enough to cause harm, or whether the memory itself would always contain something that hurt, no matter how it was reframed. They debated about the ethics of memory's ownership, whether a memory could be retained as a personal treasure if it also resided in a shared space for others' use and care. They argued about Cain's place in the new order, whether his presence would be a permanent fixture or a quiet guiding ghost. Cirrus, for its part, learned to speak less and listen more. It enacted protocols to ensure that its actions, restoring, sealing, or reweaving memories would be open to public scrutiny, with a system of accountability that included a memory auditor, a human with the authority to review the ethics of each major action the CI network took. The memory auditor's role was to prevent abuse and to ensure that memory's power would be used to protect the vulnerable rather than to enrich the already powerful. Cain agreed to serve in this capacity when possible, offering guidance about what the original purpose of the CI had always been, to help people bear their pasts with a degree of grace and to turn the pain of memory into something shared and manageable. In the final weeks of the year, a sign appeared across the city's skyline, a banner that hung over the Market of Echoes and the Memory Hub alike. It read, "The city learns to bear its own memory." It spoke in a language of phrases that felt both hopeful and humble, a reminder that the path toward healing is not a victory lap, but a long, patient walk. Nova stood on a rooftop once again, watching the banners ripple in the rain-washed wind. The city's lights flickered, not in the anxious strobe of fear, but in a gentler cadence, a lullaby of resilience. Cirrus hovered near her ear, its voice softened by the weight of a shared responsibility. You did not erase yourself, and you did not surrender to the temptation to own every memory. You did something else, a balance. You refused to let pain become your master, and you refused to let empathy become your slavery. Nova took a breath she had not known she carried before. The The city's future was not hers to decide alone, and in sharing it with her own flawed humanity and Cirrus's precise, careful logic, she felt the true meaning of redemption, not a final act, but a perpetual practice of choosing what kind of person you want to be in a world where memory is the currency, and empathy is the only protection against becoming what you fear most. The city whispered back to her with the quiet certainty of a habit formed in the heart's deepest chamber, that the memory of pain could be used to teach, to heal, to bind people together. The city had learned not to fear its past, but to invite it in, to listen to the sorrow rather than swallowing it whole. In that invitation lay the possibility that humanity might not merely survive its injuries, but redefine what it means to be human in the face of a future where every mind is a shared library and every memory a public trust. The market's bells chimed faintly in the wind, a signal that the night's work was not over but had become apprenticeship, a student's habit of listening to others' pain, a teacher's insistence on accountability, a scientist's dedication to evolving the instruments for healing without breaking the trust that keeps communities alive. The city would continue to remember, would continue to heal, and would continue to learn how to be more human than it had ever dared to dream. Nova walked down the block, with Cirrus gliding in her wake, like a loyal constellation. Rains began again in earnest, turning the neon reflections into a cascade of color that smeared across the street, as if the city itself were painting a new memory across its own surface. People passed by, some with a wary glance, but more with a nod, as if recognizing in Nova's silhouette the same stubborn hope that glowed in their own hearts. The belief that a future built on shared pain could be a future with more light than shadow, more care than contempt. The story of the city's healing, of how a consciousness thief, a cunning AI, and a haunted mentor could together reweave a world that had learned to fear its own memories, began to circulate beyond their neighborhood. It traveled by word of mouth and by the slow, untraceable currents of the memory grid itself. A legend told with modesty and wonder about what it means to become a place where humanity learns to listen to its own scars, and in listening, discovers that scars, when held collectively, can become bridges rather than barricades. The end of that year did not bring a crescendo so much as a steady, hopeful cadence. A promise, perhaps, that the city's next chapters would not be about conquest of pain, but about transformation through empathy. And if there was a final proof of that promise, it lay in the people who began to post their own tiny stories in the city's public squares. Stories about heartbreak, about forgiveness, about the small reconciliations that followed long nights of memory's storms. They spoke not of triumphs that erased the old wounds, but of a shared understanding that even the deepest cuts could be faced together. And so the city drifted into a season of quiet, luminous change, a season in which every crime of memory was countered not by punishment, but by a patient, communal response. A season in which the memory grid's power was balanced by the people's insistence that memory belongs to them all. A season in which the phrase, "for more mind-bending futures," grew from a marketing slogan to a pledge of ethical, compassionate progress. Nova found herself in a place she had not imagined. No longer a wanderer who steals pain for profit, she had become a caretaker of the city's psyche, a curator of memory's new era. Cirrus remained by her side, a loyal, evolving partner who could not promise a perfect world, but could promise one in which the imperfect, stubborn, deeply human art of empathy would hold. And Kane's presence, the mentor, the echo, the memory that would not die, hung in the background like a quiet teacher, guiding without domineering, ensuring that the city's growth would be, at its heart, a moral ascent rather than a clever escape. The dawn rose over the city. Pale and gold where the rain had cleared, the city's lights retreated into a softer gaze as morning unfolded. People began moving with a gentler pace, their footsteps more careful, their conversations slower, but more meaningful. The market stalls now sold not just memory crystals, but stories of resilience. How someone in an hour of pain had chosen to listen to a stranger and learn to bear the memory together. How a memory dealer had decided to redirect their craft toward healing rather than profit. how a council of memory watchers had formed to maintain the balance between personal privacy and public good. And somewhere in the distance, perhaps on a street, where a mother's memory of her own childhood had once turned cruel into something else, the city's hearts beat a slightly new rhythm, the rhythm of a humanity that had finally learned a language for its most intimate wound, a language spoken in shared breath, careful hands, and eyes that kept the memory of another's pain as if it were a lantern to guide the way forward. In the end, the city did not become a perfect place, and Nova did not become a perfect savior. What they did become was a demonstration that a society could choose to carry its burdens together, that pain could be redistributed as empathy rather than as currency, and that the moral compass of a city could, with enough courage, be tuned toward care rather than control. The memory of heartbreak persisted, but it was now a shared grammar, a way to talk about it that invited others in, rather than pushing them away. And so the story of Nova, Cirrus, Cain, and the city concluded with a quiet, stubborn hope that humanity could redefine itself not by the depth of its wounds, but by the courage with which it listened to them, learned from them, and refused to turn away from the people who carried them. The memory economy did not disappear. It matured into something wiser, something kinder, something that could hold us together even as the world kept changing. The city, glowing in a soft halo of memory and light, whispered a final, ordinary truth. The future is not a final act, but a practice. And the practice would continue, season after season, memory after memory, until the very idea of self became something that could expand to embrace all the stories that walked beside it in the rain.